Hello everyone, we are in the Committee of the Whole meeting for June 20th, 2017. We acknowledge today that we're meeting on the traditional territory of the Squamish Nation. So if I can get a mover for the adoption of the agenda, please. Moved by Councillor Pryor, seconded by Councillor Kent. All those in favor? Opposed? Motion carries. Okay, so our main order of business for today's meeting is the final draft of our Integrated Flood Hazard Management Plan review. And we'll turn it over to staff and Mr. Ralston.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon, Acting Mayor and Council. Here today to give the 11th update on the Integrated Flood Hazard Management Plan. It's been going on for over 3 years now. So it's been quite a detailed plan. The intent of today is to give a high-level summary of the plan and to introduce the plan to Council and to receive feedback. Introductions quickly. I'm David Rolston, Municipal Engineer with the District of Squamish, and this is Dave Broche, the Project Manager, Civil Engineer with Kerwood Lydell. So I'll start with a quick overview of Squamish's flood hazards. We are located in a flood-prone area at the head of Howe Sound and the confluence of 5 rivers. So starting from the south, the downtown and areas to the north are exposed to coastal flood risk from a combination of high tides, storm surge, and waves. And that threat of coastal flooding is expected to increase over time with sea level rise projections. Most of the rest of the developed areas within Squamish are located within the floodplains of one of the 5 river systems. That includes significant established residential areas and commercial districts. And you can see that the river floodplain overlaps with the coastal floodplain in the downtown area. There's also several areas of the district that are exposed to debris flow hazards, the most notable being the Chikai Fan in the north, which has been identified as a very large hazard. Is one of the most well-studied alluvial fans in Canada, certainly. And there's only a couple of developed neighborhoods within the district that are not located within a flood hazard area. So areas of the Smoke Bluffs and Valley Cliff neighborhoods, as well as the Garibaldi Highlands. As part of the work that's been done in this project, we've completed consequence analysis, and a Squamish River flood, a major flood from the Squamish River alone could displace over 10,000 people and cause direct building damages of close to $500 million. So there are very significant consequences that would be associated with flood, and for that reason there's a very clear need to prepare a comprehensive mitigation plan. So there has been an extensive history of flooding within Squamish since long before Western settlers began moving to the valley in the late 1800s. The Squamish Nation have an oral history of flooding that happened when people wouldn't listen to their elders, and the waters would rise so high that they would anchor their canoe to Mount Garibaldi, and only once people started coming to their senses would the waters start to recede. So since Western settlement began, there's been dozens of floods that have been caused by all 5 of the river systems as well as the ocean, to the point where it significantly hampered development, and a lot of early settlers actually just packed up and left. In the 1970s and 80s, Squamish built an extensive diking system along the rivers, and that's led to a reduction in the frequency of flooding. The most recent flood was in October of 2003, where the Squamish River was within half a meter of breaching the dike. Thankfully it didn't, and disaster was narrowly avoided, but there was still a significant amount of flooding within the Squamish River floodplain from seepage of water through the dikes and failure of drainage pump stations, and also a significant amount of flooding in undiked areas like the Paradise Valley. So based on all of these risks that the community is exposed to, as well as the significant development pressure that the community's been under for the last several years, and also changing information on climate change, the district initiated the Integrated Flood Hazard Management Plan in 2014, and the scope of work falls into 4 main phases. The first is the background and gap analysis, where we reviewed the level of flood protection of our diking system, as well as our current flood management policy, in order to assess gaps and areas of focus for later stages of the plan. And And the main takeaways there are that we had limited flood regulations. We were relying on qualified professionals to complete hazard assessments on a site-by-site basis, and there wasn't a good overarching plan to manage flood risk. Our flood mapping and our FCLs were out of date, and we didn't have a climate change mitigation strategy. In addition to that, we learned that our dikes are deficient, so in several areas the dikes are below the provincial standard, and that they're prone to seepage, and also we don't have land tenure for several of our dikes. So that phase was completed and accepted by Council in February of 2015. The second phase of the strategy was to prepare a coastal flood mitigation strategy that was highlighted by a conceptual design for a sea dike surrounding the downtown. That phase was completed in October 2015. And the third phase, we prepared a river flood mitigation strategy. So we updated our flood maps, completed consequence analysis, and prepared a comprehensive mitigation strategy. So that had a range of recommendations from dike improvements, policy improvements, emergency response planning, public education, and so on. And that was completed in August of 2016. So with those first three phases complete, we're now in the final phase of the plan, and that is compiling the work of those first three phases and into a final plan that has a policy framework as well as a detailed and prioritized list of capital improvements. And so that's what I'll be talking about today. So we've completed a significant amount of community consultation through the plan. The International Association of Public Participation provides a range of different consultation that can be completed, ranging from informing residents of decisions that are going to be made to empowering them to make those decisions. In this case, with Council's support, we settled on the involve level of engagement, which means that we committed to hear feedback from the stakeholders, to consider that feedback, and to report back at the end of the project how their feedback was considered. And so specifically the engagement activities we had is we've had 2 open houses. We have a third planned for next Monday evening at the Adventure Center. We've had a number of online surveys, workshops. As I mentioned, this is our 11th council meeting with at least one more to go. And we've had bilateral meetings with the Squamish Nation and many other consultation activities. So it's important to note that consensus may not be achievable because of the different objectives and values of the different stakeholders. So quickly, I'll talk about the guiding principles that we've used in developing mitigation plans. First and foremost, we want to reduce flood risk, but we know in a growing community that we also need to identify community development and economic development opportunities. To be making sustainable decisions, so that means taking a multi-generational and really long-term view on land use decisions, taking community feedback into account, and also considering financial sustainability. And so using all of that to design achievable solutions that are supported by the community. So as I mentioned, we have a very specific or a very detailed plan with over 100 specific tools used to mitigate risk. And this figure illustrates some of the key concepts. So first, we want to improve dike protection. So that means addressing existing deficiencies in our dike system, building a sea dike, and also adopting a higher standard of protection for the Squamish River floodplain. I'll talk about that in a little bit more detail. So that's going to reduce the probability of a flood occurring. We also want to accommodate flood hazards. So this means raising new development above flood construction levels and preserving floodways through the community. So that means that if a flood occurs, that it will reduce the consequences. Third is to limit densification in high hazard areas. So this means effective land use. We have OCP land use policy that intends to avoid densifying through rezoning in high risk areas. And lastly, to encourage growth in safer areas. And that's also been done with some OCP land use policy. And I'll talk about each of these in a little bit more detail. This table shows how, because of the unique characteristics of each of the floodplains, that those 4 strategies are applied a little bit differently within each floodplain. So quickly, within the Squamish and Mamquam floodplain, Squamish River floodplain, and the downtown, protecting with dikes is a very important aspect of the strategy. It's to be used carefully in the Cheakamus River, so there are not plans to build an extensive diking system through the Paradise Valley because of technical challenges and also the rural nature of development in the valley. Accommodating hazards is a very important aspect within the Cheakamus River because there isn't plans for building a dike protection. And it's an important aspect in the Squamish, Mamquam, Squamish, and coastal. So it's for redundancy. If dikes fail, that we ensure buildings are raised up and would not be damaged or limit damage. Avoiding development. So this means avoiding increasing the density is a very important aspect within the Cheakamus River because of there not being plans to build diking, and it's an important aspect in the Squamish and Mamquam river floodplain. So I'll be talking about the specific OCP land use policy that we've adopted. Managed retreat is something that should be considered in the Squamish, Mamquam, Cheakamus, and downtown neighborhoods. So what that means is that we consider retreating critical facilities or infrastructure out of the floodplain opportunistically. So as they reach the end of their life cycle, if there's an opportunity to move them to safer areas, that should be considered. And that the standard of protection is recommended to be the 1 in 200 year standard for all of our floodplains, with the exception of the Squamish and Mamquam River, where we're recommending to adopt a higher standard of protection, and that's in light of the significant consequences and how much development is located within the Squamish and Mamquam River floodplains. And finally, unconnected coastal sites. So this means sites like Waterfront Landing or Scott Crescent development, where if they were to flood, they wouldn't flood other sites as well. Their mitigation strategy can be based on site-specific review and what makes most sense for their development plans, and based on the qualified professionals' recommendations. So I'll get into what we intend to do in terms of improving dike protection. First is we want to correct all of the existing dike deficiencies that we have. I mentioned some of those deficiencies earlier. So there's areas of our diking system that's below the 1 in 200 year standard. We lack land tenure in several areas. We have no access, and there's a number of other deficiencies. So the plan is to first rectify those deficiencies. And the estimated cost for that is about $17 million. Next is we want to build a sea dike. So that was the subject of the second phase of the Integrated Flood Hazard Management Plan, and we have prepared a conceptual sea dike design that includes the alignment and the different type of dike that would be used in different areas. So areas like the estuary, we would employ a green shores type of approach that uses bioengineering and enhances the habitat. In areas with a little bit limited footprint and where environmental values are a little bit lower, we would use a standard dike with riprap erosion protection. And in areas like along the Mamquam Blind Channel in the downtown, where there's a limited footprint and development objectives, we would use a sheet pile type of dike where it requires smaller space to build and allows for development. One important note here is that the dike alignment was deferred during the second phase of the plan through the estuary on the west side of downtown, and that was subject to completion of a truck route study. The recommendation was that if a truck route was to be routed along the 7th Avenue connector, that it would also make sense to put the sea dike there. The truck route study has not concluded that that's a preferred alignment, and so we are now recommending that we pursue the town dike alignment, which is basically the existing sea dike alignment through the downtown. And the third aspect of improving dike protection is to adopt a higher standard of protection for the Squamish and Mamquam Rivers south dike, so the Mamquam River dike along the south shore. And that's justified by the high consequence of failure. I've mentioned over half of the community lives within the Squamish and Mamquam River floodplain. And most of our commercial and industrial activities take place there as well, so it would be very high consequences in the event of a flood. We've completed a cost-benefit analysis that shows that every dollar that's put into improving the Squamish River dike and Mamquam South would save $3.60 over a 100-year time period based on reduction in damages. So what is this higher standard? What's shown in blue here on the screen is the standard dike. That's the provincial standard. And so this higher standard of protection would be higher. So instead of a 1 in 200 year standard, it would be raised to a 1 in 500 year standard. It would be wider. So instead of a 4 meter wide dike crest, we're proposing a 6 meter wide dike crest. And it's stronger by incorporating additional measures like erosion protection on the water side and land side, and a drain on the tow trench along the land side of the dike to capture any water that seeps through the dike. So the intent here is just to reduce the probability of a flood ever occurring within the Squamish-Mamcon River floodplains. So the long-term costs to complete this are over $80 million. And I say long-term because this is to build a sea dike that would accommodate 1 meter of sea level rise. That's not anticipated to happen for 100 years. And it also incorporates raising the standard of protection beyond the provincial standard for the Squamish and Mamcon. So in terms of the protection required for today, it's about $17 million. And then there's many other longer term costs. But this is still
I think we have a quick question here from Councillor Race.
Well, just on the sea dike, could you go back to the slide that,
Yeah.
yeah, that one. So the thing that I was confused about still after reading the report was the alignment of the sea dike vis-a-vis the ocean front.
Mhm.
And in parts of it, it seemed to be that there was an option in there. And I guess the question is, where did we get to the decision on the option?
Mhm.
Whether we cut straight across more or less at Vancouver Street, or whether we somehow incorporate the entire ocean front in there. Is there any solution forthcoming to that? Is it?
I think the solution is actually going to be determined pretty soon. So it's been determined to be a special study area in the flood hazard management plan, which means that we would study whether it would be incorporated into the overall sea dike alignment, and if so, how. And so we're now reaching a point where we're going to be referring flood protection matters to the province and to the Inspector of Dikes for the Squamish Oceanfront development. And they're going to be advising us how they intend to regulate that, if they will be considering the flood protection a dike or if they'll be regulating that. It is possible for the sea dike to tie into high ground. The Squamish Oceanfront Peninsula is all going to be raised up. And so it's possible to tie the sea dike in at either end of that. And so we actually wouldn't have a dike that connects those two pieces, but the dike ties into high ground and basically closes it off. The other option is that the Inspector of Dikes considers it a dike and it wraps all the way around the peninsula. So we'll have some conclusion on that probably within the next couple of months, I would think.
Councillor Pratt?
Yeah, just on that topic, and I can imagine that if you're doing the oceanfront, you'd rather have bank stabilization than a sea dike, so I don't see it going dike all the way around there. It's just going to be lifted. But at Vancouver Street, the precaution that was put in before was actually a pile of material on either side of the road, and the dike coming up to either side of the road at Vancouver Street, coming down Mamcon and the Catamount. And in the event of high water coming, someone would actually go down there with a machine and just put a little thing across the road. And that's right.
Yeah, that's been identified as kind of an interim solution. So
Yeah.
until the ocean front has been developed and the sea dike has been built to tie into that, there is going to be a low point in our diking system, and so we would need to have an emergency response measure to close that gap in the event of high water.
Well, not to get too far into this, I recognize that this is high level at the moment, but I mean, if I'm correct, the decision, if, for example, if the dike system just cut across more or less at Vancouver Street, and the ocean front is self-contained, much like waterfront landing is, and so forth, then that would make a difference to what kind of treatment would have to go along the Mamcon Blind Channel, I take it. Or would it still be prescribed as something like sheet piling along the Blind Channel, more or less a continuation of what's already started?
The recommendation is that what happens along the Mamcombe Blind Channel should be a sheet pile regardless of what happens with the ocean front.
At least down as far as the ocean front.
Right.
Beyond that, a lot will depend on whether or not the inspector of dikes actually considers it, whether or not there's actually a berm of earth there or not, whether or not they actually consider that perimeter part of the dike system. And I agree with Councillor Pryor that they're not going to want any part of the additional regulations and headaches and everything else if there's a way around it. But at the end of the day, if IOD says, yep, thou shalt consider that part of the dike, then it's not really going to matter whether there's actually an earth berm that looks something like that up there or not, or whether it's just a bank of riprap, or whether it's a sheet pile. It's going to have to be district maintained in perpetuity, and it's going to have to be built and approved to their standards.
I just to clarify, I think it's an important technical question whether the oceanfront shoreline ends up being erosion protection or a dike for all sorts of reasons like who maintains it and that sort of thing. But I think from a practical standpoint, as far as what it looks like, they're filling the oceanfront, and then we're tying our dike into it. It's going to look the same either way physically. Like there's no gap, there's no need necessarily to run a dike down Vancouver Street. On the Mamcombe side, for example, you'll see a sheet pile going all the way across, whether that sheet pile is considered erosion protection on the oceanfront side, or it's considered technically a dike, is important to staff, but as far as what it looks like physically on the ground, it would be virtually identical.
Right, and just further to that point as well is if the inspector of dikes considers it a dike, that doesn't mean that we would then just build a dike and leave the rest of the lands low. The plan is to raise that whole peninsula up to the flood construction level regardless of how it's considered by the province. Okay, so back to the dike funding. Long-term costs are significant, and so our strategies to seeing that through is, first of all, to prioritize. And so we've done a lot of work in this plan determining where the dike is most efficient, and also where, if the dike failed, there would be the greatest consequences. And so we have used a risk-based approach to prioritize, and we'd also be phasing work over many years. So we have an implementation plan for building the sea dike that says we're not going to build it to withstand 1 meter of sea level rise from day one. We would actually build it to protect against current levels, make sure we have enough width to build it and to raise it in the future, but to be phasing that raise over time, and also to not be undertaking these Squamish River dike upgrades, adopting the higher standard until we've addressed the existing deficiencies in our dike system. So we have a phased approach to see that through. We also need to be opportunistic. So this means that through development, when someone is developing along a portion of sea dike, that they would upgrade their frontage as part of the development. And also that we would be pursuing grant funding. So there are several different provincial and federal grants that are available, and the district should be actively pursuing those. Many of them do require municipal funding. It's often split 1/3, 1/3, 1/3 between municipal, provincial, and federal. So the district should plan to have an annual budget allowance to complete those works as well. And there's some other options as well that are possible for dike funding. One of them is to establish a flood protection utility so that it would only be used for building flood protection works. It wouldn't be competing with other items out of the general revenue fund. So things like road paving and bike lanes, municipal hall. With other priorities, it wouldn't detract from flood protection. So it's a dedicated utility is an option. There is also an option to impose local area services. So if specific group who are most impacted by flooding, so say residents of a certain area, they can actually pay a local area service to improve flood protection for their area. And then there's also the potential to retain developer contributions, so people who are developing and making profits from development, that they would be, because that development is increasing the consequences of flooding over time, that they would provide a contribution to improve the flood protection systems as well.
So would that be outside of the typical DCC process, or would it be included in that?
So we have considered DCCs, and the provincial government has said that their flood protection projects are not an eligible DCC cost, so it would have to be outside of that.
And just one more thing on the flood protection utility. Are there examples of that in operation in BC right now? Like good best practices?
That's a good question. I know that there are stormwater utilities. I don't know about flood protection utilities, if there is or not.
That's probably a better question for our planning sub-consultant. We can follow that up for you.
Councillor Race.
Thank you. This is a longer discussion, and I guess my question is when we might consider the options around this. The flood protection utility, local area service, and so forth. I know Pemberton, from doing real estate transactions in the valley, had a separate diking authority. I'm not sure if it still does. With separate charges, like municipal taxes. I know when you're doing a real estate conveyance, you had to adjust for both of them. And they were similar to taxation, although some special rules around it. So that's one example of one that does exist. And we're the diking authority as well as the municipality, and so it kind of gets wrapped up into one budget. I understand that part. But it's a discussion, and there's all kinds of issues in there when I was going through the report. Not just, it's not something we're going to deal with today, obviously, but is that something that we are sort of going to be considering over the next months or year or so?
So it is a recommendation that we look at this and we evaluate these different things, these different options, and come up with a strategy. You're right that I don't think it's going to the question is going to be answered as part of the flood hazard management plan, but I think it is an ongoing project that the community should determine as to how we intend to fund these longer term upgrades. The status quo right now is that it would be through municipal funding and through applying for senior government grants. But if we wanted to supplement that somehow, we should probably have a detailed look and a bit of a study at some of these other options and see if we want to pursue those.
And they're not necessarily mutually exclusive. You could look at, it's a buffet style, really. Some are column A, some are column B. The diking districts are actually a really good example because the province is doing everything in their power to phase them out. You cannot build a new dike now unless the municipal government agrees to be the diking authority, which is not to say that you couldn't set up a parallel funding structure, which is basically exactly what we're talking about, that mimics the, say in that case, the PVDD. But it's got to be under the municipal aegis, for sure.
So in terms of our prioritized plan, I won't go through the table here in detail. It's just to show you that there is a plan. But the projects have been prioritized based on a combination. First of all, looking at the likelihood of failure. So how deficient is a dike today? Under what type of flood event would it fail? And then also looking at the consequence of failure. So dikes that are further upstream have a larger downstream area that they protect. So there's greater consequence of failure. So we've looked at those two things and basically taking a risk-based approach at prioritizing. And then on top of that, we apply a cost weighting. So what that does is it says if we can achieve a considerable risk reduction at low cost, that those projects should be escalated up the list versus, if it's a very expensive project to reduce risk, that would be a little bit lower. So in the end, we're going to be achieving the greatest risk reduction with the lowest cost in the initial projects and then working our way down the list. Okay, so now shifting gears into the flood policy overview. The Integrated Flood Hazard Management Plan is basically going to become a background report. It's completed technical work, flood mapping, and it has a policy recommendations. But then the actual policy is going to fall under three main pieces. The first is the OCP. And so we have a hazard policy section within the OCP. And it identifies broad goals and objectives for risk reduction. And it also identifies a land use policy that I'll talk about shortly. And so that land use policy will inform the zoning bylaw and future council decisions on zoning, which ultimately dictate land use. Within the OCP, we also have proposed a new development permit area, and that will regulate development within floodways. So I'll talk a little bit more about that as well, and in debris flow hazard areas. And then finally, as a standalone document, we're proposing a new floodplain bylaw that determines construction specifications for new development within the floodplain. So FCLs, setbacks, and construction materials, that type of thing. So getting into the OCP flood hazard policy, as I mentioned, it identifies broad goals and objectives, things like managing flood risk with new development. And it also identifies a land use policy that we talked about in quite a lot of detail in the last phase of the plan. So there's 3 types of areas. There's restricted densification areas. So these are areas that we would not support rezoning or OCP amendments. It includes the floodplain within the Paradise Valley, and it also includes areas that are very high risk within the Squamish and Mamquam River floodplain. So it's often areas where the river formerly occupied prior to the construction of diking. It's areas where flood depth is greater than 2.5 meters. And there's also conditional densification areas, so these are shown in yellow. And these are areas where the district would support rezoning if a set of conditions can be met. And some of the most important conditions are ensuring that that densified development doesn't transfer risk to other land, and that it doesn't increase flood levels over time. And then the third is limited densification areas, so that's shown in red, and they would need to meet the same, orange. They need to meet the same conditions as the conditional densification area, but there's also a density cap placed on top of that that would be to the equivalent of duplex density. So now getting into the development permit area, there are 3 types of areas that are going to be regulated in the development permit. The first are primary floodways. So that is main river corridors, like the diked corridor of a river. And the objectives here are to allow room for the river, and so that we can maintain flood conveyance and avoid constraining those rivers over time and increasing flood levels. So the policy there is to restrict buildings and fill. There is an exemption to that within the Paradise Valley because there are lots that are entirely located within the primary floodway. So we have an exemption process that would allow development to proceed within the Paradise Valley subject to meeting conditions. Then there are secondary floodways. So these are areas that are within dike protected corridors. They would be critical for flood conveyance if the dikes were to breach. And so the intent here is to regulate development to ensure that those floodways aren't blocked and transferring risk to adjacent lands or increasing flood risk over time. And so some of the regulations are maintaining setbacks to water courses or areas that could be critical for conveying floodwaters, having qualified professionals certify the location and orientation of buildings so that it doesn't block the floodway, and also not raising buildings any higher than they need to be, limiting floodproofing fill to building footprint, and so on. And then finally, we have debris flow hazard areas, and the intent here is to reduce risk to people and property, and primarily what this means is that a qualified professional would be retained to specify mitigation measures to site development outside of debris flow hazard areas if possible, and if not possible, that specific mitigation measures would be incorporated. And it's important to note here that the Chikai fan is excluded within this policy. Chikai fan policy is within the OCP. So development within the Chikai fan will be regulated under OCP policy. Last is the floodplain bylaw. So the floodplain bylaw does 4 things. The first is it designates floodplains, and by doing that, it provides the opportunity to regulate development within those areas. And then it establishes flood construction levels that's based on the floodplain mapping that's been done in this project. And it also specifies setbacks. So it's setbacks from water courses and setbacks from diking. And the intent there is to maintain floodways and also maintain space for the district to build diking in the future, and make sure that we have the land available when we are going to be doing these dike upgrades. It also establishes floodplain specifications, so this is to improve the resilience of new development. It's measures like using flood-resistant materials for any elements that are going to be below the flood construction level, putting erosion and scour protection around foundations to make sure that water doesn't wash buildings away or their foundations. And then lastly, it establishes an exemptions. So there's 3 types of exemptions. There's general exemptions that apply to things like renovations, interior renovations that wouldn't need to meet FCLs, building expansions that are less than 25% of the building footprint, farm buildings, entryways, garages. There's just certain things that don't need to meet the flood construction level. There's also a local area exemption. So this is the historic exemption that we have in the downtown. And this means that non-residential uses don't need to meet flood construction levels in the downtown. And lastly, we have site-specific exemptions. So this applies in the case of hardship. If there's an existing lot that can't meet the flood construction level because it's 3 meters higher than their existing grade, and their neighbors are down at ground level, and it's going to result in a 3 meter wide or 3 meter tall retaining wall next to their neighbor's kitchen. That would be a case where it may not make sense to do that. And so we have a process that would allow for exemptions in the case of hardship. So just to quickly summarize, this is the end, or getting close to the end of a 3-year project. We have done some groundbreaking work within the province in terms of the technical analysis, and we've developed what we think is one of the most comprehensive policies within BC, where we have a prioritized capital plan, and we also have this policy framework that is using OCP policy, DPA, and floodplain bylaw to achieve all of our objectives. So the next steps for us are we're going to complete community engagement, and that includes meeting with the Squamish Nation next week and also holding a public open house. And then we'll do some tweaks based on the feedback that we receive and bring the plan back to council hopefully before August, before the break, and bring a final integrated flood hazard management plan back to council for adoption. And then we'll actually begin implementing recommendations, so adopting the policies, the floodplain bylaw, and the official community plan in the fall. And of course, dike upgrades will be implemented over a long period of time after that. So that's a quick snapshot of the origins and the scoping or some of the outcomes of the flood hazard management plan, and I'll open the floor to questions and discussion.
Fantastic. So I'm going to do a speakers list of council members, and I also noticed there's a fair number of people in the audience. So after we get through sort of our initial round of questions, if you would like to speak, step up to the podium and you'll have an opportunity to participate as well. So start with Councillor Kent.
Actually, David answered my question. I was just wondering, because it had been almost a year and 15 months since we had spoken to Squamish Nation, but you handily answered my question when our next presentation is to them.
Yes.
And you actually sit and do a presentation the same as this to them?
Yes.
You do?
That's
Great.
right.
So they get the full brunt of the information.
Yes.
Thank you.
I'll tailor the information a little bit more to their specific interests, how the policy doesn't actually apply to reserve lands, how our flood protection capital works applies to protecting reserve lands in different cases. So it'll be slightly different, but a lot of the same content.
And our next open house is Monday.
That's right. Monday night, 6 to 8 p.m. at the Adventure Center.
Thanks.
While everybody else is thinking of questions, I have a few comments. One of the things that I was thinking is I think it would be useful for us as elected officials if staff come across some innovative programs that are maybe in other jurisdictions around climate change adaptation funding and strategies that could help us make more progress on this, given the fact that we are a small municipality, and that, even when it's a 1/3, 1/3, 1/3, like the 1/3 for us is very significant. And so I know that the government federally is looking at, really investing in infrastructure. So if there's anything we can do to, lobby our officials at a political level, things that we've seen in other jurisdictions, to say, hey, you guys should be doing this. I think that would be very, very helpful.
Can I quickly comment on that?
Yeah,
I just wanted to say, the Fraser Basin Council is doing, they're in, I believe, the second phase of a large flood management strategy for the Fraser Basin and the Fraser Valley, and they're going to be looking at funding. And so that is a great opportunity for the district to capitalize on the work that they're going to be doing. I know some of the analysis that they've done shows that Lower Mainland dikes, only 4% of them actually meet provincial standards. So they have a lot of the same challenges that the district faces. I think their cost estimate to upgrade dikes around the province was $9 billion. So there is a huge funding gap and a need to determine funding strategies that the district can capitalize on.
Did you already mention this?
thanks. So I have Councillor Pryor, Councillor Race, Councillor Elliott.
Yeah, thanks. Well, thanks, guys. I'm glad to see the end of this. And just looking at all the future studies, I thought, oh, well, I guess that should be good for a few years, and then I got to page 8 here, 8.4 future studies, so I have picked out a couple that I would support, but some I wouldn't want to get into that right now. Let's take a break from studies. On the one slide you had there, well, two, can you go back to the slide that shows everyone in their boats, boots?
Sure.
This one is, you know, it's been in the books for a long time. In 1994, when they did the last flood management study, I was here then and part of that, paid attention to that. And, you know, you can see the one on the right-hand side is the downtown. You can see the smoke puffs in the background. And, you know, that was really the Mampon River when it used to come through. That was actually a tidal flood. It was like a super high tide. And since then, we really haven't done anything to the dikes in the downtown. And being a downtown property owner, I don't lose sleep over it so much anymore, but when I first, 30 years ago, bought property here, I was losing sleep after every high tide, every extreme high tide. And the water actually down at the old lumber yard, to this day, at super high tides, runs across the road. So, and then I see in here that you've got the downtown sea dike as up for an upgrade. I just want to confirm that we're going to put a berm along the Blind Channel. That's part of the #1 things to do.
Yes, so the recommendation is that as one of the top priorities in the plan, one of the top large-scale projects is that we build the sea dike to protect against current sea levels, and that we basically build it wide enough that we can raise it, you know, to withstand sea level in the future, but you know, that we basically build as soon as possible a complete sea dike that protecting the downtown.
No temporary berm that we can do like this year?
Well, I think that what the recommendation is to build it to 3.3 meters as soon as possible.
Yeah.
And so, I mean, you can call that a temporary berm. It should all be suitable material that can be built on top of in the future and wide enough so if we need to gain land tenure that we're kind of considering the longer term. But yeah, that we wouldn't build it to the ultimate standard now. We would build it to the height that it needs to be to protect against
Because
current
pretty
sea
much
level.
all the land is accountable, and, you know, there's maybe 1 or 2 pieces in there that you might have to talk to a property owner, but it's all accessible
Right.
to 313. Okay, well, that's good. I mean, 1994 plan showed that as a priority, so I just want to make sure that's a priority.
Yes.
And then another thing you guys showed was a cross-section of the dikes, and we're going beyond the provincial standards?
For the Squamish River Dike and for the Mamcom River
Oh,
South Dike.
Just the river dikes.
Just those 2 dikes, that's right.
Well, I guess that makes sense. We're paying for it. And then the last one was in the OCP. I'm just wondering, you say encourage land development in non-flood areas, which is the highlands. And I'm wondering if that's reflected in the OCP because we have some large tracts of land that are wanting to come into residential. And it says, one of the questions in the OCP is, do you want to densify existing, or are we going to reach farther out? The flood management plan would be saying, reach farther out.
We haven't gone that far. We've given recommendations to encourage growth in low risk and safer areas. So that safer areas includes the Garibaldi Estates. It's in the floodplain, but it's a lower risk area. And so there's different areas that are, even if they're in the floodplain, even the downtown is considered an area for densification. It's not
Yeah,
just saying.
I was just curious whether it was contradictory to what may happen to some of these big forest lots.
Yeah.
If I may try to answer that question. The OCP does consider the flood hazard management plan, but it's not the only thing that it does. So this plan wouldn't be in conflict with the OCP, but the OCP considers other things like making sure that we're not sprawling. So it does encourage development in the higher areas to an extent.
That's all.
Get through your list. All right. Councillor Grace.
Thank you, and thanks for the presentation, that was good. I was able to follow that.
It's a nice time.
It's been a long 3 years.
I can almost recite parts of it now. But my question was around funding, and I alluded to it before because we can set priorities and so forth, and without the funding, we're nowhere. So clearly there's senior government money available and other things that Councilor Blackman Wolf is talking about, but there is going to be inevitably a municipal portion of that, and so I guess I'm just wanting to encourage staff to bring that to us as quickly as possible, because we should perhaps be even thinking about it before next year's budget discussions to start that. Whether it's a separate utility, whether there's a local area thing, I mean, there's pros and cons. It's a bigger discussion than today. But I think it's important that we start dealing with some of these funding models very quickly. Otherwise, it's just a study that isn't going to happen, right? Because we've got to get it.
Yep. That's noted. I would like to highlight right now in the 5-year financial plan, we have an allowance of $2.1 million per year for dike upgrades. It's assumed that that's with receiving grant funding, so $700,000 from municipal sources, and then assuming that we would be successful with receiving grant money. So we have included an annual allowance, but I take your note that we should be considering how else we can fund dike upgrades moving forward.
Well, yeah, and I guess the simple comment is that may not be enough. You think about, for example, the sea dike in front of our park downtown, Blind Channel, which we so far haven't been able to pass on the responsibility for that to anybody else, as well as the river dikes and the deficiency in the river dikes. There's a lot of money that could be spent very quickly to get to the point where we're sleeping better at night for council Pryor. So
Yeah. Okay.
I'll leave it with you there.
Councillor Elliott.
Thank you. So in the section where we're talking about funding the capital projects, it talks about future developers of riparian properties will be required to upgrade their dike frontage as a condition of development. So that's what we're seeing along the Mampum Blind Channel. But how does that affect individual homeowners who aren't creating massive buildings, but will be required, possibly if they want to do something, subdivide their property into two to upgrade their, is that a hardship? Like, are we considering this by size or?
By rezoning. So it would be for properties that are rezoning next to dikes. If someone wants to come in with a building permit or even a subdivision, I don't think it would be made a requirement to upgrade their frontage in those cases, only if they're increasing their development density.
Okay. My second question is, so we talked about the floodplain bylaw, and so how are we going to make sure that we make this easy on developers, because they'll have OCP policy about hazards, they'll have zoning bylaw that will talk to land use, they'll have a subdivision and control bylaw that will speak to some of this, there will be a site alteration bylaw that will speak to some of this, and then now there's going to be a floodplain bylaw. So how do we make this sort of customer friendly for developers? so that so the goal isn't always changing as they're moving through the process. So that's a lot of different documents to cover to try and get that.
Yeah, good question. So it is a recommendation in the plan to create a developer guide, basically a summary, a high-level summary that here are the relevant policies. I mean, OCP policy is not typically something that's going to apply on a site-by-site basis. A lot of the site-specific review is going to be within the floodplain bylaw. So most development is going to need to meet the floodplain bylaw. If they're within a floodway, then they would need to meet development permit area regulations. And then OCP is broad goals and objectives and land use policies. So if someone wants to rezone within one of those controlled densification areas, they would need to know that policy. But I think we'll need to create a developer guide that spells that out in a 2 to 3 page document of what are the relevant policies, how do they apply, and kind of create a really simple and kind of streamlined explanation of the policies.
I would also just add to that currently the planning, engineering, and environmental staff spend a great deal of time with prospective developers in a pre-app process, where when people come in, we walk them through all the requirements specific to their site and talk them through, you're in a secondary floodway, this is what this means, and this is what the policies will be. So that's the service that we provide as well.
Well, I take that point, but I also know that sometimes people go through their pre-app meeting and then a few months down the road, something else comes up that someone forgot or something new. So it's just making sure that we're always thinking about how we roll this out to be customer friendly. My other question then is, Chris?
We'll let you ponder that for a
Yeah,
few
thanks,
minutes.
Jason.
So I just had a couple of other things as far as the hardship exemption process. So would that be done via like a development variance permit? Or what kind of process are we looking at? And is it a delegated authority? Is it going to come to council and bit of both? And if so, when? And that kind of thing?
So it's built into the bylaw. It's called a site-specific exemption, and it would be regulated or approved by the general manager of community development, so currently Gary Buxton. He would be the approver of that. And there are fairly explicit guidelines as to what circumstances exemptions should be given. So the term hardship is defined in the bylaw as to what that means. It can't be a site preference. If a developer has a preference that they'd rather have their building in one spot of their lot versus another, it's got to be a valid hardship that they cannot build if they need to meet the regulations within the bylaw. So it's spelled out fairly clearly, and it would just be an application of an applicant would say, we're applying for a site-specific exemption. They have a qualified professional who would be retained in order to kind of say that there is a hardship and specify any mitigation measures. So it's not just that an exemption would be provided and then they don't need to meet any requirements. It's an exemption's provided, but they still need to raise up as high as they can, as high as is reasonable. So that whole process is spelled out.
So would it be correct to say then is it's more similar to our current process where, if there's a property that has some riparian issues and that they can't quite meet the setbacks and all of that, and staff deals with it versus it's not like a development variance permit?
It would be entirely dealt with at the same time.
Councilor Elliott, did you?
Yes, I remembered. Where the conditional densification areas, and so they'll have to do flood modeling. And so have we worked out how, and I think we discussed earlier as council when that fits in terms of rezoning applications, but have we looked at how that's going to be a smooth process so people know how long it takes, how much it's going to cost, so that all gets wrapped up at the beginning of the process?
Yeah, so we're working our way through the first example of flood modeling right now with 41601 Brennan Road rezoning application in Brackendale. So we now have an idea. I mean, this is a large site and it's a large development, and I think the cost to complete flood modeling will vary based on the size of the development and some specifics. But we have an idea of the ballpark cost now and what the process is. We have a very similar process in place already for sewer and water modeling that takes place as part of development. So it basically follows the same process. It's just a different scope of work that's undertaken. But we would use Kerwood Lydell, who have the district's flood model. And because our guidelines say that any individual development can't increase water levels by more than 10 centimeters, but that the cumulative over time can't increase by more than 15 centimeters, that means we need to have a central consultant keeping track of all of these changes and densified developments that are happening over time, or else we're going to lose track of that 15 centimeters. So we do need to have an organized system in place that tracks what developments are taking place.
Can I,
So,
Can I- sorry, could I add to that?
well, can I just say, so do we need operating costs in our budget then to make sure that as development happens, we're updating the model? So like what needs to change about how we're tracking this?
So I think that the cost is going to be wrapped up into the consultant's scope of work that they're going to, as part, a little bit with each application, they're going to have to be documenting and keeping track of what modeling's been done and what changes have been made. So it's not going to be a district cost, it would be covered by developers who are densifying.
It would have to be part of reopening and closing the model, that when we reopen it the next time, we know where we left off, what's been changed, what hasn't. So that if we had to, if a development came forward and was all go, no quit, and then somebody bailed and it just never happened, and it just, for whatever reason, we'd have to be able to roll back, or there's a lot of those. The one thing that I wanted to add to what David said is I think we've been talking about Garibaldi Springs as a good example that is within some of these areas where we're taking another look. And if there is a way that an engineer can say, without recourse to the model, yeah, we're confident that that's going to be okay, and that it's just not going to really drive the flood issues further up for others in the floodplain, then of course there's no need to undertake the model. And that's kind of the first screening level approach. Is there an easy set of assumptions that we can make around what you're doing, looking at your plan? Yep, you're good. And just sidestep the process.
Just to add in one little bit of explanation to that, the reason why a site, I mean, the example is Garibaldi Springs, and the reason why that site is used is because it's not within a secondary floodway. That site isn't critical for flood conveyance. It would flood sort of in a backwater condition, so that means if you raise that site, it's not going to be really transferring risk to adjacent lands or constraining the floodway. So we're going to use judgment wherever we can and say, there's no utility in spending a bunch of money doing modeling. We're only going to do it where it's needed.
Thank you. I wanted to add as well, because what I'm hearing from Councillor Elliott is process for the developer and clarity, and dovetailing the floodplain bylaw into all of the other development bylaws, and how do we ensure that they get that information. And I know that staff, as Mr. Wickham said, do have the pre-app meeting, but we're also working on other processes in terms of, a really comprehensive developer guidebook, and helping to inform developers and making sure through the process that our processes are clear and as easy as possible for them versus making them go out with a stack of bylaws. I mean, it is ultimately up to the developer to understand the bylaws, but we can facilitate that. And that's the goal.
Thank you. So one other thing, just in terms of getting back to sort of the land use issue, and I'm wondering, so if we got the dike up to the super dike level, like the 1 in 500, does that change some of the assumptions around intensity of land development within the covered area? Is that what we envision? And the reason I'm asking this is, say for instance, very long time down the road, we are getting to a point where, say we're halfway there, and there are development proposals come along, and some very significant ones want to put money in and accelerate that process so we get to the 1 in 500 a lot faster, but of course wanting more intensive use. use. Would that be something that's possible under this plan, or is it something that we're kind of locking in to say, no, like, this is gonna be it even at 1 in 500?
So a couple responses on that. One is that when we're going through the river phase of this project, we're looking at flood risk. And so risk is basically the probability of an event or the likelihood of an event happening and the consequences of the event. And so with this strategy, we're trying to reduce the likelihood of an event happening, and that's with protection, with dike protection, but also trying to reduce the consequences. And so working on both of those efforts, we're saying that within restricted densification areas, those are not areas that even with improved dike protection that we would recommend to increase development density. So I think that recommendation is probably something that stays firm over time, even with improved dike protection.
And so would those be the ones in red on the
That's
map?
correct, that's correct. And then the other point to make was just that we're likely decades away from actually being in that condition to where we would have a 1 in 500 year dike protecting the Squamish and Marquette River floodplain, just because of how much work and funding constraints. So it's likely a challenge or a question that we'll be facing many, many years in the future.
Okay, yeah, because the thing that I always struggle with is that the fact that, you know, the way our town has grown, I mean, the areas from a smart growth perspective where it makes sense to grow the most are in these areas because they're well served by transit and those kinds of things. So just trying to maximize that as much as we can without putting undue risk. I do understand the consequence argument and that makes a lot of sense to me. So on that note, I'm wondering if we've done some preliminary analysis, or we are looking at doing a preliminary analysis of how it will affect the development capacity in our existing areas so that we can have an informed discussion as we finish up the OCP. Because I know right now staff had done that analysis, and I want to know if it is the case that that was already taken into consideration, because we had some preliminary numbers projecting how much capacity we have.
Yes, we did consider the implications of the kind of restricted densification areas, and that's why in the projections, for instance, Brackendale had a range that was very low and a bit higher, but the higher number was due to the potential if the Shikai Fan ever gets developed.
Right.
So it certainly incorporated these assumptions.
Excellent. Any questions from the audience? Anybody have anything else that we haven't talked about yet? Wow. Well, and just to remind the audience and folks at home, you said your next open house is coming up quite soon.
Yes, Monday, June 26th, 6 to 8 p.m. at the Squamish Adventure Center. There'll be a presentation at 6:15 and then just an open discussion in the lobby after with storyboards.
And to recap as well, we're expecting this to come back to us hopefully before August. So that's when we'll hopefully be wrapping it up. All right, well, if there's no other questions, I think I'll seek a motion to terminate the meeting. Oh, actually, we have a recommendation, sorry. I got a little ahead of myself there. A motion to receive the draft integrated flood hazards management plan and associated policies for review. Moved by Councilor Pryor, seconded by Councilor Race. All those in favor? Motion carries. Thank you.
Thank you.
And we'll go for a motion to terminate. Moved by Councilor Kent, seconded by Councilor Elliott. All those in favor? Motion carries. Thank you, everybody.